Picture a group of monks gathered around a small clay furnace, deep in a mountain monastery. They are not soldiers, they are not engineers. They are alchemists, searching for something that has nothing to do with war at all, a formula they believe capable of granting eternal life. Now picture that same furnace, centuries later, packed into an iron tube, aimed at a city wall, capable of ending a life in a fraction of a second. Both of those moments, the search for immortality and the birth of gunpowder warfare, trace back to the exact same substance discovered by people who were trying to build the opposite of a weapon entirely. This is the strange, mostly accidental story of how one of history's most consequential inventions was never actually invented on purpose. To understand how it happened, you have to go back to China. Somewhere around the 9th century, during the late Tang dynasty, a period when Taoist alchemy was taken extremely seriously, funded by emperors, practiced by respected scholars, not dismissed as superstition the way it often is today. Taoist alchemists were obsessed with one specific goal: the elixir of life, a substance they believed could halt aging, cure disease, and grant something close to immortality if only the right combination of minerals could be found. Their laboratories were filled with ingredients we would now recognize as genuinely dangerous: mercury, sulfur, arsenic, and a mineral salt known as saltpeter, each believed to hold some hidden spiritual or medicinal power. Alchemists combined these substances constantly, heating them, grinding them, mixing them in different ratios, recording the results in detailed manuscripts, searching for the one formula that would finally work. This was painstaking, repetitive work, carried out over years, sometimes across entire careers, by scholars who genuinely believed they were closing in on one of the greatest secrets in existence: the ability to defeat death itself. Somewhere in this process, alchemists began combining saltpeter with sulfur and charcoal, three ingredients that, individually, seemed unremarkable enough. But mixed together and exposed to flame, the combination did something no elixir experiment had ever done before. It did not heal, it did not preserve, it violently, unpredictably combusted. The earliest known written warning about this discovery survives in a Chinese alchemical text from this period, describing an incident where alchemists mixing these exact ingredients caused a fire that badly burned their hands and faces, and even set a building ablaze. This was not the outcome anyone had been searching for. The text does not celebrate the discovery. It warns against it, cautioning fellow alchemists to avoid this particular combination entirely, treating it as a dangerous failure rather than a breakthrough. For a while, that is essentially what it remained: a hazard to be avoided in the pursuit of something else, a footnote in the long, strange history of alchemy's countless failed experiments. But knowledge, once written down, has a way of spreading and traveling far beyond the intentions of the people who first recorded it. Within a few generations, references to this volatile mixture began appearing in military contexts, no longer as a cautionary tale for alchemists, but as a tool being actively investigated by Chinese military strategists. By the 10th century, Chinese texts describe early incendiary devices using this powder: fire arrows tipped with burning charges, thrown bombs designed to ignite on impact, primitive weapons that use the mixture's flammability rather than any explosive force. The transformation from alchemical accident to military technology did not happen overnight. It unfolded across roughly 2 centuries. As successive generations of craftsmen and military engineers refined the mixture, adjusted its proportions, and gradually discovered that certain ratios produced far more dramatic effects than others. The historically dominant formula that eventually emerged, roughly 75 parts saltpeter to 15 parts charcoal to 10 parts sulfur, was not arrived at through any single insight. It was the product of generations of trial and error, refined slowly by people who had no understanding of the underlying chemistry, only careful observation of what worked and what did not. By the 11th century, during the Song dynasty, gunpowder had become a serious subject of state interest, formalized enough that the Chinese government published a military compendium, a text now considered one of the earliest detailed technical manuals in history, documenting multiple gunpowder formulas for different applications, some designed for maximum flame, others for maximum smoke, others for slower burning incendiary effects. The Song government took this technology seriously enough to establish dedicated workshops, staffed by thousands of workers, whose sole job was producing gunpowder and gunpowder weapons for the imperial army, an early example of a state deliberately organizing industrial-scale production around a single military innovation. Song dynasty China faced constant pressure from powerful neighboring states to the north, and this pressure appears to have driven much of the rapid experimentation that followed, each new threat pushing engineers to refine their weapons further, testing new casings, new ratios, new delivery methods, in a cycle of innovation driven almost entirely by necessity. This period saw the invention of some of the earliest true gunpowder weapons: fire lances, essentially bamboo or metal tubes packed with gunpowder and attached to spears, capable of launching a burst of flame and sometimes shrapnel directly at an approaching enemy. These fire lances represent a critical turning point, because they mark the moment gunpowder stopped being used purely for its incendiary properties and started being harnessed for its explosive propulsive force, the exact principle that would eventually define every firearm built afterward. Early fire lances were crude and short-lived, often good for only a single burst before the bamboo tube itself burned away or split apart under the pressure. But engineers gradually replaced bamboo with metal, extending the weapon's usable life and increasing the force it could safely contain. From fire lances, Chinese engineers progressed to increasingly sophisticated bombs, some designed to be thrown by hand, others launched from catapults, some packed with iron fragments specifically to maximize injury on detonation, a design philosophy that has barely changed in the 1,000 years since. Military records from this era describe iron-encased bombs, sometimes called thunder crash bombs by contemporary chroniclers, capable of producing an explosion loud and violent enough to reportedly panic both enemy soldiers and their horses, a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. By the 13th century, references appear to something resembling an early cannon, a metal tube capable of launching a projectile using gunpowder's explosive force, rather than simply burning or throwing something at an enemy. Archaeological discoveries have since confirmed this timeline, with surviving bronze hand cannons from 13th century China representing some of the oldest true firearms ever recovered, weapons that, despite their crude construction, already contained every essential principle that modern firearms still rely on today. This is roughly the same period when gunpowder began traveling beyond China's borders, and the primary reason for that spread has a name most people would not expect. The Mongols' Mongol Empire at its height stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the edges of Eastern Europe, and Mongol armies were remarkably effective at absorbing military technology from every culture they encountered, including gunpowder weapons captured or adopted from Chinese forces during their conquest of the region. As Mongol armies moved west, they carried gunpowder weapons and gunpowder knowledge with them, introducing the technology to the Middle East and eventually to Europe through a combination of warfare, trade, and captured engineers forced to share their expertise with new rulers. Chinese engineers, captured or recruited during Mongol campaigns, were often deliberately relocated to serve in Mongol armies operating thousands of miles from their homeland, carrying with them not just finished weapons, but the accumulated technical knowledge of exactly how those weapons were built. This pattern repeated itself across the empire's vast reach. Islamic scholars and engineers, encountering gunpowder weapons through contact with Mongol forces, began their own period of experimentation and refinement, developing distinct formulas and weapon designs suited to their own military traditions. By the mid-13th century, references to gunpowder began appearing in Middle Eastern texts, and shortly afterward, in European ones, spreading along the same trade and conquest routes that had long carried silk, spices, and other valuable goods between East and West. One of the earliest confirmed European references to gunpowder comes from the English scholar Roger Bacon, writing in the 1200s, who recorded a formula for the mixture, though notably encoded in a scrambled, deliberately obscured form, suggesting Bacon understood exactly how dangerous this knowledge could be if it spread carelessly. Whether Bacon learned of gunpowder through Islamic scholarly networks, through trade contacts, or through some other route entirely, remains debated among historians. But his writing marks one of the clearest signs that gunpowder knowledge had officially arrived in Europe, centuries after its accidental discovery in a Chinese alchemist's laboratory. Once gunpowder reached Europe, its evolution accelerated dramatically. Driven by a continent locked in near-constant warfare between rival kingdoms, each desperate for any advantage over the others. European metalworkers, already skilled in casting church bells and other large metal objects, adapted that same casting expertise to produce increasingly large and powerful cannons, weapons that would prove devastating against the medieval castle walls that had defined European warfare for centuries. The impact on European siege warfare was not gradual. Fortifications that had withstood sieges for hundreds of years, walls built thick enough to shrug off catapults and battering rams, began falling to cannon fire within days, sometimes hours, forcing an entire continent to rethink how castles and city walls were designed from the ground up. By the 14th century, gunpowder artillery was reshaping European siege warfare entirely, and within another century, handheld firearms had begun appearing on battlefields as well. Early, unreliable, difficult to aim, but carrying the seed of every rifle and pistol that would eventually follow, the social impact proved just as significant as the military one. For centuries, European warfare had been dominated by armored knights, whose years of specialized training and expensive equipment made them nearly untouchable on the battlefield. An entire social class built around the assumption that martial skill required a lifetime of dedicated practice. Firearms changed that calculation almost overnight. A peasant conscript, given a few weeks of training with a gun, could kill an armored knight who had trained for that exact purpose since childhood, a shift that quietly, permanently altered the balance of power between Europe's nobility and its common soldiers. What makes this entire story so genuinely strange when you step back and look at it as a whole is how little of it was planned. Nobody set out to invent a weapon capable of reshaping global warfare. Alchemists were searching for immortality and stumbled into combustion instead. Chinese military engineers spent centuries refining a mixture through patient trial and error, without any real understanding of the chemistry driving it. Mongol conquerors spread the knowledge simply by doing what conquering armies do, absorbing and redistributing whatever technology they encountered along the way. European craftsmen adapted casting techniques originally developed for something as peaceful as church bells and turned them towards something considerably less peaceful. At no point in this centuries-long chain of accidents, adaptations, and unintended consequences does there appear to be a single moment where someone can be credited with deliberately inventing gunpowder as a weapon. It was discovered by people looking for the opposite of death, refined by people looking for better ways to defend cities and armies, and spread by empires, simply doing what empires have always done, absorbing every useful piece of knowledge they came across, regardless of where or why it was originally created. Historians studying this period often point out something else worth sitting with: how long the gap actually was between the original accidental discovery and its eventual transformation into a true weapon of war. Nearly 2 centuries separate that first recorded laboratory fire from the earliest fire lances used on a battlefield, and nearly 2 centuries more before anything resembling a modern firearm existed. Revolutionary technologies, it turns out, rarely arrive in a single dramatic moment. They accumulate slowly, refined by generations of people who never fully grasp what they are building, until the final version looks nothing like the accident that started it all. The alchemists who first recorded that dangerous fire-producing mixture, warning their fellow scholars away from it, could not possibly have imagined what that warning would eventually become: a technology that would end the age of castle walls, reshape the balance of power between empires, and quietly set in motion a chain of innovation that leads directly to every firearm, artillery piece, and explosive device built in the 1,000 years since. Somewhere in a mountain monastery centuries ago, a group of monks were simply trying to live forever. Instead, they created something that has decided again and again throughout the centuries that followed exactly how many lives would not